Welcome to our new series of interviews and updates about the Campbell collaboration. In our first interview, we're talking to Michael de Wiebe and discussing the Campbell review of mindfulness-based stress reduction interventions for improving health, quality of life, and social functioning in adults. The review was written by Michael de Wiebe, Arild Bjørndal, Elizabeth Tipton, Karianne Tune Hammerström, and Christina Kowalski. Michael, thanks for joining us today. I wondered if I could start by asking you a little bit about the Mindfulness Campbell review you worked on and what the topic was that the review addressed.
Yes. The question was whether one particular form of mindfulness training, namely mindfulness-based stress reduction, has an effect on mental health outcomes, physical health outcomes, and social functioning in adults.
And what were the key findings of this review?
The key findings were that the MBSR intervention has a moderate and consistent effect on mental health outcomes, has a small and less consistent effect on physical health outcomes, and there is very few data on the effect on social functioning.
What would you say the implications are of this systematic review for the arenas of policy and practice?
The implications are that mindfulness training in the form of MBSR courses can have a place in assisting people to cope with mental health issues, either when they are physically ill or mentally ill, or in the normal population. Another implication is that it raises a lot of questions that the review did not answer. So the implications are that further research should focus on longer-term follow-up and also include outcomes regarding social functioning.
I'd like to open up the discussion now, and I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about mindfulness, what it is and what its origins are. A lot of people are practicing mindfulness and are familiar with the term, but perhaps they may not be aware of the history behind the concept.
It is difficult to say what mindfulness is, because it is not just one thing. There are many ways of conceptualizing it, but broadly speaking, you can say that it is training the capacity to be aware and attentive of what is going on. Mindfulness is a way of training the mind, and it originated in Buddhist psychology 2,500 years ago. Introspection was the main way of developing human beings at that time, and mindfulness is a core practice inside Buddhism. And then in the last century, the West became interested in the Eastern contemplative practices, and mindfulness became contextualized within a non-secular setting, especially through the work of John Kabat-Zinn at the University of Massachusetts. To me, mindfulness is a particular quality of consciousness. It is the ability to be aware and attentive of what is present here and now, inside and outside. So that is how I conceptualize mindfulness. And when you look at how mindfulness is conceptualized in Buddhism, mindfulness is one part of Buddhist practice. It is called the heart of Buddhist meditation, but it is still just one part. And when they trained mindfulness in the original traditions, they trained several aspects of mindfulness. They trained, for instance, the concentrative aspect, the attention aspect, and they trained the open monitoring aspect, the awareness aspect of mindfulness. And if you think about it, you can be attentive to one particular thing that you're doing, but you're not necessarily aware of anything else. Or you can be both attentive and have the ability to be aware. So there are different aspects. And then there are some other aspects in the traditional setup that have come into Western mindfulness practice to some degree, and that is training the attitudes that favor mindfulness. And those attitudes are the attitude of non-judging, of curiosity, of tolerance, of compassion, so that in the original Buddhist practices, these were attitudes that would favor the growth of mindfulness. And in the West, when you look at different conceptualizations of mindfulness, they have to a varying degree incorporated, for instance, compassion training, or training the attitude of non-judgment or of curiosity, so that mindfulness is not just one thing. Mindfulness comes from the traditions with a package, and it's part of a package. And the problematic thing is that we have, in a way, extracted mindfulness from that tradition and put it in a secular setting, and then we are building it up in a secular way. And of course, along that path we will lose some things and we may gain some things. But it is important to specify what is this practice of mindfulness teaching. We have chosen one format, and that format is called mindfulness-based stress reduction, and it's a format that has different elements, and there are some aspects of the traditional mindfulness that is not in it, but many of the core elements are present.
I'd like to pick up on something you mentioned. You said that mindfulness is many things. How did that understanding impact the decisions you took when conducting this systematic review? What is it that you are measuring when you're saying you're measuring mindfulness?
It raises many questions, and our answer to that was to narrow it down to one particular form of mindfulness training. And we chose the form that has been developed by Jon Kabat-Zinn because that is the most widely used within a Western non-religious context. And what we can say then is that we are measuring the effect of one particular form of mindfulness training. And in the inclusion criteria, we decided to stick to the key elements of that format. So the four main elements within the mindfulness-based stress reduction program had to be present in all the studies that we were looking at for them to be included.
Was there anything about the findings in this Campbell Systematic review that struck you as surprising or unexpected?
It was a bit surprising to find that we measured the same effect in populations with mental health issues and in population with somatic health issues and in populations from the normal population. That was a bit surprising. But come to think of it, we try to explain this by why people seek this intervention. And basically people seek it as a stress management program. And in that respect, most people that voluntarily come to the program will presumably have some degree of stress or stress-related suffering. And when we looked at the populations more closely, we see that within the group that has mental health issues, we have only included populations with mild to moderate mental health problems. So with that limitation, I think perhaps it's not so surprising. But it surprised us to start with.
Yeah.
And another thing that was a bit surprising was that studies that used intention to treat analysis and studies that used per protocol analysis, where they only analyzed the people that completed the intervention, there was no difference in the findings. And that was a bit surprising. And it was also a bit surprising to find that when we assessed all the 31 studies regarding the degree of bias that we found in the studies, the results did not correlate with the degree of bias that we measured. So that was also a bit surprising.
If people ask the question, does mindfulness work, or how certain can we be that it works? Based on the research you did for this review, what would your response be?
I would say that mindfulness does work. It has an effect, a consistent effect on mental health outcomes for the populations that we have looked at. And one way of looking at the effect is to compare it to the effect that you would find in other reviews that look at psychological interventions for mental health problems. And we see that we have the same effect sizes in our review as they report. So that is one way of assessing it. And another way of assessing it is looking at how many new studies without any effect is needed for our effect size to be reduced from a moderate effect size to a less than small effect size. And you would need 44 studies without any effect to null out the effect of the 31 studies in our review. So that is also a way of in a way, weighting the evidence. And a third way is that we used a new system for grading the evidence, so-called grade methodology, where you can either grade the evidence as high, and that is to say that new studies are not likely to change the effect estimate significantly, or moderate, that new studies may change the effect size to some degree, or low, or very low. And when it came to the mental health outcomes added up, the grade was high. So it's unlikely that new studies will really alter the effect size significantly. The same was true of stress-distress outcomes. When it came to anxiety and depression outcomes, the grade was moderate. So new studies may influence the effect size that we found. When it came to quality of life measures and mindfulness measures, the grade was low, so that we don't have enough evidence regarding those outcomes.
Some people would say, given the nature of mindfulness, that applying a systematic review to a subject like this is an unusual approach. It might, for example, not be regarded by everyone as an intuitive approach to use methodologically. I wondered if you could talk about why you decided to use a systematic review framework for analyzing mindfulness. You mentioned, for instance, that its origins lie in the traditions and practices of Buddhism. Might some people be initially uncomfortable about the idea of using a systematic review approach in this context? I wondered what your thoughts were on this.
I think that in areas where you get a lot of research, you will normally always have studies that show no effect or show a negative effect, and studies that show a positive effect, so that you can pick out one study to support your view on mindfulness quite easily. And therefore, if you have many studies that uses the same method and the same control groups and the same study designs, so they are randomized control designs. If you then pool all those studies together and look at the effect across the studies, then you can find an average effect. And the advantage of that is that some studies may be done really well, some may be done not so well. Some have many participants, some have few participants, but adding these together and using statistical methods to average the effect, you get an estimate that is more reliable.
Based on your findings, a question that people might ask would be, could you generalize these findings to other settings? How confident can one be? How sure can one be that what you've said about this mindfulness-based intervention as having a positive effect, how confident could one be about generalizing this to other settings?
There are certain conditions that you have to take into account before you generalize it. Firstly, the control groups that were used here were waiting list or treatment as usual. So if you should generalize the effect, you have to say what you are comparing with. And if you compare with active interventions, then there might be a different set of outcomes, comparing, for instance, cognitive therapy to mindfulness therapy. But we compared it to a waiting list or treatment as usual. And the second is that the populations we had are a fairly wide range of populations, but there were certain limits on that. One limit was that it was adults, so we can't generalize to children or youth. Another limitation was that most of the studies excluded people with severe mental illness, like suicidal behavior or severe depression or psychotic illnesses, so that we can't generalize to those populations. But we can fairly, with a certain degree of certainty, generalize to similar populations that we have looked at. And that is because the studies have come from many different countries. They were not only US-based, but there were studies from Asia, from Europe, and from America.
There's been a lot of discussion and commentary recently in newspapers and via social media about mindfulness, and a lot of debate about the scale of the uptake of mindfulness. There have also been a few recent articles in The Guardian, for example, about mindfulness having potentially negative side effects. You mentioned earlier that you didn't study people who were suffering from severe mental illness or who were vulnerable in that way. What would your response be to those who claim that mindfulness may also have potentially negative impacts for such populations? Who claim, for instance, that there are potential risks as well as benefits to the practice of mindfulness?
I think it's very important that those questions come up. And it's still early days in the mindfulness research field. And when we looked into the studies, there were no reports on side effects in these studies that we looked at. And we know from other research that side effects do occur. And the side effects are of two basic categories. One category is expected side effects, and that is when you become aware of yourself and your situation, you may become aware of things that are really unpleasant, both inside and outside, so that you may actually experience more suffering when you become aware of what is there. And that aspect of the mindfulness training has been focused on in the East, in the traditions always, but has been less to the forefront in the West. And I think that is important, because people come and may think that this is a panacea for all ailments, and it's not. You may say that mindfulness is very simple, but it's not easy. It is quite challenging to look inside, and it's challenging to be with what is painful in your life. And we don't really want to do that. We want to keep what is painful at an arm length or under the carpet. And the second part of the side effects, or possible side effects, is of course that if you focus inwards and you don't have a sufficiently stable ego structure, then nobody can follow you inwards. Nobody is there with you to experience what you're actually experiencing. And so there is also always a danger when you shut the external world out and look at your internal world, that becomes too much for you. And I think one should pay attention to that. And that is why, if you use mindfulness training for specific patient groups, one need to know those patient groups and be qualified to handle what is coming up when they practice.
This systematic review has been produced, but there appears to be a lot more mindfulness-related research being produced. Can you talk us through what happens to systematic reviews like this after it's published and the updating process? And could you also talk perhaps about the direction your research is taking?
Yes. We have now started to update the review, and at the time, in 2010, we looked through 3,000 references on mindfulness and found 31 randomized controlled trials. From September 2010 until now, in that 4-year period, we are finding 70 more randomized controlled trials. So we are hoping that when we now are going into those studies, we will be able to say with a greater sense of certainty, are the findings from 2010 still valid, or do we have to revise our view? And also we hope now that we will find sufficient number of studies that compare mindfulness-based stress reduction to another equivalent active intervention, so that we can say with more certainty, how does it favor one or the other in that comparison?
Finally, I'd like to ask you a methodological question about a rather unusual approach you used in this review. It's called robust variance estimation, I believe. Can you talk about what this is and explain why you think using this approach is important?
There is one aspect of this review that is novel as regards most other systematic reviews and meta-analyses, and that is that we've used a new statistical method to adjust the effect size and the confidence intervals. And the reason why we have used that is that if you measure 5 different outcomes in the same person, those 5 outcomes will be related. And to adjust for the correlation between the outcomes, we have used a particular statistical method. And that addresses the robust variance estimation adjusts for us having used many outcomes measured on the same people. And each study measured on average 5 outcomes from the individuals in the study. And those 5 outcomes will be related. And the error variance of those outcomes will be related. And this statistical method adjusts the effect size and the error variance according to the dependency. So that method, we think, will be used much more often in future systematic reviews.
Michael, thanks so much for sharing your insights about this very interesting Campbell review. And we look forward to speaking again with you soon about your research. It was really good to meet you. This interview was produced by the Campbell Collaboration. Find out more about the work we do by visiting our website, www.campbellcollaboration.org.